The morning sun streamed through the windows of James Washington's study, casting a warm glow on the rows of medals and photographs that lined the walls. At 72, James still maintained the straight-backed posture of his military days, though his hair had long since turned silver. His home, a well-kept two-story house in the peaceful Oak Grove neighborhood, stood as a testament to his years of service and hard work. Every morning, James would sit in his favorite leather armchair, sipping coffee and looking through old photo albums. Today, his weathered fingers traced over a particular photograph, a younger version of himself standing proudly beside his S-16 fighter jet. That was taken just before one of his most challenging missions during Desert Storm, a mission that earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross for saving his entire squadron through quick thinking and exceptional skill. After retiring as an Air Force colonel with 35 years of service, James couldn't just sit still. His neighbors often saw him tending to his small garden or helping local kids with their homework on his front porch. He had a special soft spot for young people who dreamed of flying. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he volunteered at the local Veterans Center, helping fellow service members navigate the complexities of civilian life. The kids in the neighborhood called him Uncle James, and their parents trusted him completely. He was the kind of neighbor who would mow your lawn if you were sick or clear your driveway of snow without being asked. His wife, Linda, had passed away 5 years ago, but he kept himself busy by being there for others. Their daughter lived in another state with her family, but she called every Sunday without fail. What made James special wasn't just his military achievements or his community service. It was his ability to maintain his dignity and kindness in the face of prejudice. It was just past noon when James left the Veterans Center, his heart warm from another meaningful session helping fellow service members. The autumn air was crisp, and golden leaves danced across the street as he drove his well-maintained Mercedes, a retirement gift he'd given himself after decades of service. The car represented more than just luxury. It was a reminder that a boy who once couldn't afford school books had achieved his American dream through hard work and determination. The veterans' meeting had run longer than usual because a young soldier needed extra support dealing with transition stress. James didn't mind. Helping others was what he lived for. He hummed along to an old jazz tune on the radio, thinking about stopping by the grocery store to pick up ingredients for his famous chili. The neighborhood kids were coming over that weekend for their monthly cooking lesson, a tradition he'd started to help busy parents. As he turned onto Maple Street, just 2 blocks from his house, red and blue lights flashed in his rearview mirror. James was puzzled. He always drove carefully, especially in residential areas. He'd done this countless times before during routine stops in his younger days. Stay calm, be polite, keep your hands visible. Growing up, his father had taught him these unwritten rules, and James had passed the same wisdom to his own daughter. Officer Tom Reynolds was having a rough day. 3 domestic disputes, a shoplifting case, and now this expensive car moving suspiciously slowly through a neighborhood that had reported several recent break-ins. Fresh out of the academy and eager to prove himself, Reynolds had quickly developed a habit of seeing threats around every corner. James pulled over smoothly, positioning his car properly against the curb. He turned off the engine, placed both hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and took a deep breath. Through his side mirror, he watched the young officer approach, hand resting on his holster, a detail that made James's heart sink a little. After decades of serving his country, these moments still filled him with a familiar tension. The neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Chen, who lived across the street and whose garden James had helped replant last spring, paused while watering her flowers. Mr. Rodriguez, the retired mailman who often joined James for morning coffee, slowed his walk with his golden retriever. They knew James well. He was the backbone of their community's neighborhood watch program. License and registration, the officer demanded, his tone sharp enough to cut through the autumn air. James moved slowly, narrating his actions just as he'd learned. "Officer, I'm reaching for my wallet in my back pocket. and then I'll get the registration from the glove compartment." His voice remained steady, dignified. But Officer Reynolds seemed uninterested in James's careful cooperation. "Just hurry up and don't make any sudden moves," he snapped, eyes darting between James and the car's interior. The officer's body camera blinked silently, recording every word, every gesture. James could feel his pulse quickening, not from fear, but from a deep, familiar disappointment. He'd hoped things would be different now, especially in this neighborhood where he'd lived for over 2 decades. Through his career, he'd broken barriers, commanded respect, and helped pave the way for others. Yet here he was, being treated like a suspect in front of his own neighbors. As he carefully retrieved his documents, James caught sight of the photo of his late wife, Linda, tucked into his wallet. She had always told him to keep his head high and his heart strong, no matter what. Right now, he needed her wisdom more than ever. The next few moments would test everything he stood for: his dignity, his patience, and his belief that education and understanding could bridge any divide. Officer Reynolds studied James's license and registration with exaggerated scrutiny, his flashlight beam dancing across the documents despite the bright daylight. "This is a pretty expensive car for this neighborhood," he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Where did you say you got it?" James kept his voice steady, though his heart ached at the implication. "I purchased it from Thompson's dealership downtown after my retirement, officer. I've lived in this neighborhood for over 20 years. You could see more neighbors gathering now." The Paddles had stepped out onto their porch, and old Mr. Johnson had stopped pruning his roses to watch. "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Reynolds commanded, taking a step back and placing his hand on his holster again. The movement wasn't lost on James, who had trained countless young officers during his military career on proper protocol and human interaction. James complied slowly, deliberately. "Officer, I want to inform you that I'm going to unbuckle my seatbelt and exit the vehicle now." His military training helped him maintain his composure, even as the situation became increasingly degrading. He could feel the eyes of his neighbors, people whose children he'd tutored, whose homes he'd watched over during vacations, whose lives had intertwined with his over decades. The autumn wind carried fallen leaves across the street as James stood beside his car. He was wearing his veteran's center volunteer polo shirt, pressed khakis, and polished shoes, his usual attire for mentoring sessions. "Officer, if I may explain," he began, but Reynolds cut him off. "Hands on the hood, feet back, spread 'em," Reynolds barked, as if he were dealing with a dangerous criminal rather than a 72-year-old community pillar. Mrs. Chen had stopped pretending to water her flowers now, her watering can forgotten in her hands as she watched the scene unfold with visible distress. As James assumed the position, his joints protesting the uncomfortable stance, he thought about all the progress he'd seen in his lifetime. He'd gone from being one of the first black officers in his Air Force squadron to commanding hundreds of personnel of all backgrounds. He trained young pilots who went on to become generals, breaking barriers and changing mindsets along the way. This car was reported in a series of break-ins, Officer Reynolds declared, though no such report existed. "You match the general description we received." It was an old excuse, one James had heard too many times before. "Officer," James tried again, his dignity intact despite the humiliation, "my ID shows that I live at 1242 Oak Street. That's this house right here." He nodded toward his home, its American flag gently waving in the breeze, the carefully tended garden visible from the street. But Reynolds wasn't listening. He began a pat-down, rough and unprofessional. James's wallet fell from his pocket, scattering its contents across the pavement. Among them was his military ID, his pilot's license, and the worn photo of him receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross. Mr. Rodriguez couldn't stay quiet any longer. "That's Colonel Washington," he called out. "He's lived here longer than you've been alive, officer." Other neighbors began to murmur in agreement, their phones recording the incident from various angles. Officer Reynolds paused, glancing at the scattered credentials on the ground. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face as he saw the military ID, the medals and the photos, the evidence of a life spent in service to the very principles he was now trampling. James remained still, his hands on the hood of his car, but his voice took on the quiet authority that had commanded respect through decades of military service. "Officer Reynolds," he said, reading the nameplate, "I've spent my life serving this country and training young people like yourself. All I'm asking for is the same respect I've earned protecting the rights you're currently exercising." The moment hung in the air, heavy with history and possibility. A young officer faced with his prejudices, an elderly hero maintaining his dignity, and a community holding its breath, watching justice unfold in real time on their quiet suburban street. The scattered contents of James's wallet lay on the ground like pieces of a life puzzle: credit cards, his Veterans Center ID, and photos of his family mixed with fallen autumn leaves. Officer Reynolds still hadn't allowed him to move from his position against the car, even as the crowd of neighbors grew larger and their murmurs of disapproval grew louder. "I've got some questions about this military ID," Reynolds said, picking up the card with his gloved hand. "Looks pretty fancy for someone who claims they were just at a veterans center." His tone dripped with disbelief, each word a fresh wound to James's dignity. Through the growing crowd, Mrs. Chen's grandson pushed forward with his phone recording. The 12-year-old boy, whom James had helped with math homework countless times, looked on with confusion and hurt in his eyes. "But Mr. Washington is a hero," the boy called out, his young voice cracking with emotion. "He showed us his medals in class last Veterans Day." Officer Reynolds turned sharply toward the boy. "Step back behind the line," he ordered, though there was no line. The gathered neighbors had formed a loose semicircle around the scene, their faces showing a mix of outrage and disbelief. Some had their phones out, documenting everything. James remained steady, his military bearing intact despite the growing discomfort in his aging joints. "Officer," he said calmly, "there's a photo in my wallet of me receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross. I flew over 100 combat missions. I've trained pilots who are now commanding their own squadrons. You can verify all of this." "Sure, and I'm the president," Reynolds scoffed, but his voice carried a hint of uncertainty now. He glanced at the growing crowd, at the phones recording his every move, at the scattered evidence of a distinguished life lying at his feet. Mr. Rodriguez's golden retriever whined softly, sensing the tension in the air. The old mailman held tight to the leash, his free hand clenched in frustration. "This is wrong," he said loudly. "Colonel Washington has lived here for decades. He's the one who organized our neighborhood watch." A young mother stepped forward, holding her toddler. "He helped my family when our house flooded last spring," she added, her voice trembling with emotion. "He's the one who got the whole street to pitch in and help us rebuild." The body camera on Officer Reynolds' chest continued its silent recording as he rifled through James's car, finding nothing but a folder of Veterans Center paperwork and a bag of groceries intended for the weekend's cooking lesson with the neighborhood kids. James felt each minute stretch like an hour, the hot hood of his car pressing against his palms, the eyes of his community witnessing his humiliation. He thought about all the young people he mentored, the lessons he taught about dignity and perseverance in the face of prejudice. Right now, he was living those lessons in the most painful way possible. A police cruiser pulled up quietly, its lights off. The shift supervisor stepped out, taking in the scene, the gathered crowd, the recording phones, the distinguished elderly man still pressed against his car, and the young officer whose actions had created this situation. The supervisor's eyes widened as she spotted something among James's scattered belongings. A newspaper clipping featuring a younger James in his full dress uniform, standing beside Air Force One. The headline read, "Distinguished Colonel Breaks Barriers, Leads Elite Squadron." The autumn breeze carried the sounds of more approaching sirens. What had started as a routine traffic stop had become something much bigger. a moment that would force their community to confront uncomfortable truths about prejudice, power, and the ongoing struggle for dignity and respect. The shift supervisor, Lieutenant Cooper, stepped forward with purpose, her 20 years of experience evident in her calm but authoritative demeanor. She'd recognized James's name instantly, not just from the newspaper clipping, but from the department's own training materials about community policing and civil rights history. "Colonel Washington," she said, her voice carrying both respect and concern. "I'm Lieutenant Cooper. Would you please stand up, sir?" The change in tone was immediate and striking. Officer Reynolds' hand dropped from his holster, his confident demeanor crumbling as he watched his supervisor's reaction. James straightened slowly, his dignity intact despite the ordeal. His neighbors let out a collective sigh of relief, though their phones kept recording. Mrs. Chen's grandson darted forward with a bottle of water, which James accepted with a gentle smile that masked his discomfort. "Officer Reynolds," Lieutenant Cooper said, her voice level but stern, "Colonel Washington isn't just a resident. He's a decorated war hero who helped design our department's community outreach program 5 years ago." She picked up the scattered contents of James's wallet, handling his military ID and medals photographs with obvious respect. The young officer's face flushed as he looked properly at a military ID for the first time. The photograph showed James in his full-dressed uniform, silver eagles gleaming on his shoulders, rows of ribbons telling a story of decades of distinguished service. But the report about break-ins, Reynolds began weakly, only to be cut off by his supervisor. "There were no reports of break-ins in this neighborhood," Lieutenant Cooper stated firmly. "And Colonel Washington has been a homeowner here for over 20 years. She turned to James, her expression apologetic. "Sir, I was at your lecture last year about building trust between law enforcement and the community. I never imagined we'd be meeting again under these circumstances." The gathered crowd had grown larger. Parents were explaining to their children in hushed voices who James was, what he meant to their community. The young mother, whose house he'd helped save during the flood, was crying quietly. Mr. Rodriguez's golden retriever had finally settled, sensing the shift in energy. James looked at Officer Reynolds, seeing not just a young cop who'd made a serious mistake, but someone's son who needed guidance. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice carrying the weight of wisdom earned through years of leadership, "I'd like to share something with Officer Reynolds, if I may." The lieutenant nodded, and James turned to the young officer. "Son, 35 years ago, I was the only black colonel in my squadron. I faced challenges you couldn't imagine. But I learned that the best way to fight prejudice isn't with anger. It's with excellence and education." He gestured to his car, his home, his neighbors. "Everything I've achieved came through serving others and believing in the power of understanding. The uniform you wear and the one I wore both represent a promise to protect and serve everyone equally." Officer Reynolds stood straighter, his face a mixture of shame and dawning understanding. The body camera caught every word as James continued. "I'd be happy to tell you about my experiences, about the changes I've seen and the ones we still need to make. Sometimes the hardest lessons become our best opportunities to grow." Lieutenant Cooper watched the interaction with growing appreciation. She'd seen countless confrontations end badly, but here was a man who'd every right to be angry, choosing instead to turn a moment of humiliation into an opportunity for learning. The autumn sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the street where neighbors still gathered, witnessing something extraordinary. Not just the exposure of prejudice, but the power of wisdom and dignity to transform it into a teachable moment. Word of the incident spread quickly through the community. By evening, local news vans had parked along Oak Street, their satellite dishes reaching into the darkening sky. The body camera footage had already made its way to the police chief's desk, and social media was buzzing with videos taken by neighbors. James sat in his living room, surrounded by concerned neighbors who'd refused to leave his side. Mrs. Chen had brought over her famous dumplings, while Mr. Rodriguez and his wife arrived with fresh coffee and pan dulce. The young mother, whose house he helped save during the flood, sat nearby, her toddler playing quietly with toy planes, a gift James had given him last Christmas. "You should sue them," someone suggested, but James shook his head, stirring his coffee thoughtfully. "That wouldn't solve the real problem," he replied. "We need to build bridges, not walls." The police chief himself arrived at James's door that evening, apologizing profusely. But instead of demanding Officer Reynolds' badge, James surprised everyone with his response. "I'd like to help create a new training program," he said firmly. "One that brings officers and community members together to share their experiences and learn from each other." The local veterans groups had already organized a peaceful gathering for the next day. They called it a Stand for Respect rally, and it brought together people from all walks of life. Military veterans, community leaders, and citizens who simply believed in dignity and fairness stood side by side in the park. Officer Reynolds had been placed on administrative leave pending an investigation, but James requested to speak with him. They met in James's home office, surrounded by photographs of his military career and the many young pilots he mentored over the years. "I was wrong," Reynolds admitted, his voice heavy with emotion as he looked at a photo of James receiving his Distinguished Flying Cross. "I let assumptions cloud my judgment. I forgot that the badge means protecting everyone, not suspecting anyone." James leaned forward in his chair. "When I was your age," he began, "I had a commander who didn't believe I belonged in the cockpit of an F-16. He made my life difficult until the day I saved our entire squadron during a dangerous mission. After that, he became one of my strongest supporters." The young officer listened intently as James continued. "That taught me something important. Sometimes people just need a chance to learn and grow. I'd rather help you become a better officer than see you lose your badge." Together, they began outlining a new training program. James would share his experiences, both good and bad, with police cadets. Local community members would be invited to participate, sharing their own stories and perspectives. The goal wasn't to shame or blame, but to build understanding. The police department's internal investigation revealed that several other minority residents had experienced similar treatment. Instead of burying these findings, the chief, inspired by James's approach, decided to use them as a catalyst for department-wide changes. Local high school students, led by Mrs. Chen's grandson, started a Know Your Neighbor project, interviewing elderly residents about their life experiences. James's story became the first episode, and soon others came forward to share their own tales of challenges and triumph. The incident had shaken their community, but like an earthquake that reveals hidden strengths in a building's foundation, it had also exposed the deep bonds between neighbors and their capacity for growth and forgiveness. 1 year had passed since that autumn day on Oak Street. The community center was packed with people gathering for the first anniversary of what they now called the Bridge Building Initiative. James stood at the podium, his silver hair catching the light, looking out at faces both familiar and new. Officer Reynolds sat in the front row, no longer the uncertain rookie, but now an instructor in the police academy's community relations program. He'd spent the past year working closely with James, turning his mistake into a mission for change. His fellow officers had been skeptical at first, but the results spoke for themselves. Civilian complaints were down 60%, and community trust was growing stronger every day. "When I was just a boy," James began, his voice carrying warmth and wisdom, "my father told me that true change happens one heart at a time. I didn't fully understand what he meant until last year." He glanced at the newspaper clipping being passed around, a photo of him and Officer Reynolds teaching together at the police academy. The training program they'd created had grown beyond their small town. Police departments from 3 neighboring states had adopted their model, sending officers to learn from their experience. But it wasn't just about police training anymore. Schools invited James and Reynolds to speak about turning conflicts into conversations. Community groups used their story to promote understanding and respect. Mrs. Chen's grandson, now 13, stood up to share how the Know Your Neighbor project had spread to other schools. "We thought we were just collecting stories," he said, "but we were really building a family." The project had revealed countless hidden heroes in their community, survivors, pioneers, and everyday people who'd overcome extraordinary challenges. The young mother, whose house James had helped save during the flood, now ran a community support network, inspired by how neighbors had stood together during the incident. "Colonel Washington taught us that community isn't just about living near each other," she explained, bouncing her toddler on her hip. "It's about standing up for each other." Officer Reynolds took his turn at the podium, his badge gleaming under the lights. "A year ago, I saw what I wanted to see, not what was really there," he admitted. "I forgot that behind every face is a story, behind every person is a lifetime of experiences." He turned to James, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for showing me that the biggest impact we can have is choosing to learn from our mistakes." The changes weren't just local anymore. Their story had inspired police departments across the country to revamp their training programs. James had traveled to speak at national conferences, sharing how one difficult moment had transformed into a movement for understanding. But perhaps the most meaningful change was visible right there in the community center. People who might never have spoken to each other before were now sharing coffee and conversation. The veterans group had merged their meetings with community youth programs, creating mentorship opportunities. Even Mr. Rodriguez's golden retriever had become a regular at community events, wearing a vest that read "Friendship Ambassador." As the evening wound down, James stood in the center's doorway, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of hope. A group of kids played nearby, supervised by a mix of parents and off-duty officers who now knew each other by name. The world wasn't perfect, but in their corner of it, they'd proven that understanding could grow from the soil of misunderstanding, and respect could bloom in the garden of second chances. "The uniform doesn't make the person," James often said now. "It's the heart underneath that counts." And in their community, hearts had grown bigger, stronger, and more connected than ever before. The incident that could have torn them apart had instead become the foundation for something beautiful. A true example of how humanity's greatest strength lies in its ability to learn, grow, and transform together.